Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel, Dark and Creepy. All stories are written and narrated by me, MC Allen. I found this entry in my great-great-grandfather's diary, and it has haunted me ever since I first laid eyes upon it. My father said that he heard that our great-great-grandfather enjoyed playing practical jokes on people, and says that this was probably just another way to scare whoever got his journal in the family. Reading through it, however, proves to me that he was not messing around when he wrote this. There is far too much detail put into it for me to believe that it was all made up. The diary entry is dated June 4th, 1840, and says, "Ever since the incident at the mines about a year ago, our small mining town has never been the same. Something happened in those mines that can't be described any other way but unnatural. Most of the miners escaped the collapsing shafts, but for the ones that didn't, they didn't die, to simply put it. But after somehow miraculously surviving a year in those tunnels, came out as if nothing had happened. The workers who were excavating the buried mine to retrieve the bodies of the dead were scared to the very center of their souls when the miners came crawling out with their white eyes. All of them were alive except two, whose bones were picked off clean. Many suspected cannibalism, but held their tongue, understanding that these miners had just spent a year in a pitch-black, collapsed cave. The miners hated the light coming from the sun because it burned their eyes and scorched their skin. News reporters for the state newspaper showed up soon to report on the miraculous way all 7 of these miners were able to survive. They were shocked to see that the men had pure white eyes and were still able to see. Their previously black pupils were barely a shade darker than the white. I was horrified when I first saw them, because they had lost a large amount of the pigment in their skin, which made them all look sickly pale. The news reporter began to ask some questions, and they tried to reply, but their voices were mangled, sounding like a broken printing press. The reporter asked them to nod their heads instead, and said, "Are you happy to see your families again?" They all nodded, agreeing, but in a strange manner. The reporter then asked, "Are you ready to have normal food and water again?" They were slow to answer this time, and one of them even grew a slight smile on his face. But they then nodded and agreed. This sent an eerie feeling to my gut, and I decided to head home, because if I was them, I would have rather died in the caves than come out like that. Though, the first night in the town since their return was horrifying. I lived alone, and all through the night I could hear their mangled voices out on the street, talking to each other. I didn't understand what they were saying, but it seemed like they could understand one another. Trying to sleep with the sound of sandpaper rubbing together outside from their voices was nearly impossible. When I got up for work the next morning, they were gone. I went to work like any other day, and it wasn't until I went to bed that I could hear them again outside of my house. I let out a long sigh and hated how they only came out at night. I understood that the sun scorched their eyes, but they have to get used to it sometime or another. That's when I heard a scream come from the street outside. It was gut-wrenching, and I jumped to the window to see what had happened. Gazing out, I saw nothing but the dark street, until I saw their eyes. There was nothing worse than seeing those white eyes pierce my soul as the rest of their body was hidden in darkness. I thought about going outside, but the thoughts of being around those guys scared me, and I'm not exactly sure why. They were still human beings, but they were not the same people when they first got stuck in that mine. The next day, I was on my way to work when I heard a woman crying with a crowd gathered around her. So I went to figure out what was wrong. The preacher had his arm around her shoulder and said in a comforting tone, "Don't worry, Miss Frank. I'm sure your son just snuck out of your house during the night to go fishing. He is, after all, a teenager." "He never snuck out of the house before, and if he did, he would have been back by now," she replied while letting out loud cries and sucking in gulps of air. The town sheriff was asking her more questions about any other places that her boy may have gone, when his deputy came running up in a panic. "Sheriff Johnson, you're gonna need to see this," the deputy said while taking in deep breaths and wiping the sweat off his brow. "Did you find my baby?" Miss Frank asked eagerly while trying to dry her tears. The deputy took off his hat and said in a low tone, "Ma'am, your son is dead. We found his body in the old mine." Upon hearing this, her cries roared out like thunder and shook me to near tears with how mournful they were. Her husband tried to comfort her as he held back the tears the best he could. Before they headed home, Mr. Frank turned to the sheriff and said, "If he was murdered, Sheriff, you better damn find the bastard." The sheriff nodded mourningly and followed his deputy. I worked as a waiter for the local pub and decided I was going to go in a little late due to that I wanted to see what had happened. I thought about the scream that I heard last night and wondered if that was the boy. A whole crowd followed the deputy as he led us up the mountainside to where the mine shaft was located. There, inside, was an entirely new set of bones than the miners who had died in there that were previously taken out and buried. They were picked clean like the miners who had died in there. "You don't suppose that that's the sheriff hesitated to finish his sentence, as he thought about who in their right mind would have done this. "We don't know for sure, sir, but the bones are too small to be a grown man's, and the hip bone is not broad enough to be a female," the deputy responded as he pointed at the bones dispersed randomly on the cave ground. The sheriff then noticed a large crowd that had gathered around and said loudly, "If you are not involved in this investigation, or have no clues to tell us what happened to this here boy, then please disperse." Many people began to turn around and headed back towards the town. I stayed back, and the sheriff asked me what I knew about the death of the boy. I responded, "Last night, I heard a scream, and when I looked out my window, all I could see was the wide eyes of the miners, who just got freed from this cave we are in right now." The sheriff stroked the scruffy hairs on his chin as he said, "Huh. If it was not for those miners being released and us seeing the bones of the two that didn't make it out, I would have suspected this boy to have died by an animal." The sheriff stopped as he looked me in the eyes and said, "Thank you for your time. You may leave now." I walked down the mountain and I truly wondered if those wide eyes actually ate that boy. When I showed up at work, my boss was mad that I was late, but I told him that I had to tell the sheriff what I heard and saw as an excuse. He understood me and asked, "So, was that boy really just bones in that cave? Some people that walked in here before you did were telling me about it." "Yeah, it was not a pretty sight is all I can say," I replied as I put on my waiter's apron. "Oh, I feel bad for Miss Frank. It's terrible to lose a child, but to know that someone or something ate him as they did, that's a whole nother level of sorrow right there, and I..." A bullet shot echoed across town before my boss was able to finish what he was saying, and everyone ran outside to see what happened. A few more shots followed, and someone was screaming with their lungs out. Everyone in town ran over to where the deputy laid on the ground with his hands over his face, just screaming and kicking the ground with his old leather boots. The doctor ran up to him and asked him what had happened, while the doctor pried the deputy's hands off his face. "Here, let me see what happened," the doctor said after finally removing his hands, and everyone gasped at the sight. His nose was gone, which blood came squirting out of the newly formed hole in his face. Also, there was another hole where something had torn off his skin from his cheekbone, which now revealed his teeth and tongue. One woman fainted, and a man threw up. The sheriff came running over with a rifle in his hand, yelling, "That thing who did this to him ran off into the woods over yonder. I need everyone that has a horse and a gun to follow me." We all asked him what it was that attacked the deputy. He responded while gritting his teeth, "White eyes." We all understood and were horrified by the atrocities committed by them. We listened to the sheriff, and there were about 20 people in all who came, and I was among them. We rode in the direction that the one who attacked the deputy ran off into. As we rode, I looked at the ground to see if there were any tracks of the white eye, and wondered how a man was able to run away so fast. I then noticed a footprint, but in front of it was a handprint, and then more followed in that order. This guy was crawling on all fours. My thoughts screamed at me. We rode for a while, and we were all surprised at how long this man was able to run. It was inhumanly, and our nerves started to get the best of us. The sun began to hide behind the mountains when we noticed that the tracks started to circle. That's when we heard its horrible, mangled voice. It was like sandpaper being rubbed against metal, and the thing started to screech. We now were able to see the man, and his clothes were tattered and barely hung onto his pale skin. The sheriff aimed his rifle and pulled the trigger. Blood splattered out of the man's side, and his wide eyes grew wide. and a smile came across his face as he let out another screech. I covered my ears due to how piercing it was. "What's he doing?" one of the men asked as we all stared at the bleeding pale man. "I don't care. That thing is mine," Mr. Frank screamed as he dug the spurs in his horse's sides to get it to charge. We all watched on as Mr. Frank got about 10 feet from the wide eye. Then, out of nowhere, a flash of white dove from a nearby tree and tackled him off his horse and started digging into his face. We all instinctively pointed our guns and fired, but more of the wide eyes leaped from the forest and ran as if they were wolves on the hunt. My heart started to pump out of my chest while my mind spun about what was about to happen. All I knew was that those guys were not human anymore, but powerful demons with piercing white eyes. The sheriff yelled at us to stay and to fight, but we knew we were no match for these things, and so we rode off on our horses as we could hear the crunching of bones echo from behind. However, the crunching faded out and was replaced with heavy panting. I glanced back and saw that the wide eyes were chasing us, and not just that, they were able to run faster than our own horses. One of them passed me by and leaped on the man in front of me. It yanked him to the ground, while his horse continued to run without him. I didn't stop, but pulled out a knife and pressed it close to my chest, just in case. One of the wide eyes then leaped at me, but all it caught was my boot, which it sunk its teeth into. The bite was so powerful that it felt like a boulder was crushing my ankle. I took the butt of my rifle and hit the wide eye in the face until it let go of me, but those eyes scarred me. They didn't close even when I slammed the butt of my gun into them, and it never blinked once, but just stared at me, straight into my eyes. We kept on riding, and the wide eyes soon stopped chasing us. There were only about 11 people who survived the attack out of the 20 men. The rest of the town was horrified when they heard about what had gone down. No one slept well that night, knowing that those humanoid creatures roamed in the forest near our town. Everyone wondered what happened in that cave that made them become that way. We never were able to kill those things, and they still roam on the outskirts of town. Sometimes people go missing from the town, here and there, and we all know what happens to them. That's why we made it a town rule that you could only be outside of your house or in the woods when the sun was out. If the sun ever went down and you were wandering in the woods, most likely you'd never be heard from again. But if you somehow managed to escape from them, you would be haunted by their wide eyes for the rest of your life, the same way I am still haunted by that stare I received when that thing crushed my ankle. It didn't just want to eat me. It wanted more than that. It wanted my soul. On nights when the wind dies down, you can sometimes still hear their mangled cries come from the forest. And if you gaze too long into the woods at night, you will surely see a pair of wide eyes staring back at you. That's how he finished the diary entry, and I touched it up a little bit here and there for it to make more sense. Everything he wrote after that, he never brought up the wide eyes again, but just slightly referenced them and how he hated the dark after that. He grew up in a different state than I did, and I'm thinking of visiting this place to see if I can see where he grew up. But to also explore this story, to see if it is true or not. I'll inform you of what happens when I get there.